Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is not yet ready to assign blame for Tuesday's deadly explosion at a hospital in Gaza.
Obviously, the hospital explosion was a terrible, terrible thing. We deplore the loss of civilian life, of innocence. We are working with our allies internationally to make sure that we can determine exactly what happened.
Several Jewish groups here in Canada have taken issue with the Prime Minister's comments Tuesday in the immediate aftermath of that deadly blast. Here is what he said then.
The news coming out of Gaza is horrific and absolutely unacceptable. International humanitarian and international law needs to be respected in this and in all cases. There are rules around wars, and it's not acceptable to hit a hospital.
In a joint statement, B'nai Brith, the Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and Friends of Simon Wiesenthal's Centre said that response gives credence to the false narrative of the Hamas terror group. Michael Mostyn is the Chief Executive Officer at B'nai Brith Canada, and he joins us now. Mr. Mostyn, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You heard the Prime Minister's comments there today. He says Canada is working with its allies to determine exactly what happened. Your thoughts on his current position?
Well, the United States has already reviewed the intelligence, and they have found for themselves that Israel is not responsible. France has actually just come out as well and said that Israel is not responsible. This was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad missile which misfired and landed in the parking lot right beside a hospital, killed some innocent civilians, and that is tragic and terrible. And unfortunately, many of these terror missiles misfire. People estimate up to 40% of these missiles are misfiring and killing innocent Gazan civilians. It's absolutely unacceptable. But what is the holdup? What is the wait? France and the United States have already stated that this is the fault of a terror group. There are rallies, hate rallies, taking place across this country that include, unfortunately, genocidal chants against Jews and against Israel. And the longer that Canada goes by not making a decision and stating that this is wrong, this was not Israel, this is misinformation from Hamas, the more that we are going to see the safety risks increase against Canada's Jewish community.
On Tuesday, the initial comments in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, when a lot of people kind of got this weird. Trudeau didn't explicitly assign blame in the clip we played earlier. He said the news coming out of Gaza was unacceptable, international law needs to be respected, and that it's not acceptable to hit a hospital. Your statement is trouble with that, but why does that, as you say, give credence to the false narrative of the Hamas terror group?
Well, there's only one party that there's any expectation will accede to international law, and certainly that is Israel. Countries accede to human rights law, and Hamas does not. Hamas is a murderous, barbaric group. So the implication, although you're absolutely correct, there was no blame laid by the Prime Minister on Israel, but who's supposed to be conforming to international law? Clearly, it's only Israel. And there are many out there right now that are taking the silence of Canada and taking a position and saying that they need to weigh the evidence as, well, maybe Israel did do it. And this is something that the Jewish community is always concerned about blood libels against Israel and the impact, the anti-Semitic impact that it has on everyday Jewish Canadians. And so the question is, what are we waiting for? And if the Prime Minister is waiting for further evidence, what sort of evidence? What is the timeline? He has an obligation to let Canadians know.
He's not alone in this in the G7. The statement I saw from Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, on Wednesday is that we shouldn't be in a rush to draw conclusions. So what do you make of that? That it's not just Justin Trudeau, it's also the British Prime Minister, unless something has changed in the last hour that I haven't seen. He still says no rush to conclusion.
Well, if that's the only comment that an individual is making as the head of state, that's one thing. If they don't want to comment, that's one thing. But Canada did make a statement. They made a statement, violations international law. And so, again, implications, it's what's going on in people's minds. And again, I'm based here in Canada, and I can only advise you what's taking place inside the minds of the Jewish community of Canadians. And we just today in Toronto, where I'm based, we saw another hate rally outside of a Jewish community center in downtown Toronto, a little kids' school out there, and people are getting frightened. Families are getting frightened. And we don't see any changes. These rallies are ramped up rhetoric. It's insightful. And there are many Jewish Canadians that are afraid that this is going to continue to grow and grow, and this will pose an ongoing safety risk. And nobody wants to feel unsafe in their own home.
Just one more question about the Prime Minister and his position. Do you expect him to assign blame, like, yes, this was Islamic Jihad, as I say, or would a vindication of Israel, in your view, be enough, as France has now done and the U.S. has done? I mean, saying it's not Israel as opposed to clearly saying which group it may be inside Gaza, which may be difficult to prove conclusively.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly it would, first of all, acceptable, of course, to say that it was not Israel. If it was a terror group and we're not sure which barbaric terror group it was, if it was Hamas working with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, these may be details that Canada is not in a position to ever get. But certainly stating whether or not Israel is responsible or not, that's really important. And once again, if Canada is going to be taking a pause, and it has been making a couple of comments, public comments so far, we do owe an obligation to say, well, what exactly are we waiting for? Is it different intelligence than what the Americans in France have received when President Biden said it wasn't Israel? The U.S. is satisfied. What's the timeline, and what exact evidence, different evidence than what the Americans have received, is Canada looking for?
You talked about the protests outside the Jewish Centre in Toronto, and kids in school should be allowed to go to school without facing harassment, no matter who they are and where they are. We saw the Prime Minister, we saw a video of him today. He went to a mosque in the Toronto area and he was booed there. So there is this social upheaval that has happened in the wake of this. I mean, how do we move ahead as a country, Mr. Mostyn? Like, there are people who go to pro-Palestinian rallies who are not pro-Hamas, just as there are people who are horrified by what happened on October 7th, but worry about what's going to happen in Gaza once the ground invasion begins, right? It seems, though, the conversation is at such extremes and anger is so high, justifiably in many cases. How do you navigate this, as a society, so that this doesn't turn into something even worse than it is at this moment?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And there's no question Muslim Canadians are being targeted and Jewish Canadians are being targeted right now. And a lot of this has to do with perceptions, bias, internal bias. We all have bias. But how can we treat each other with civility and respect and as individuals? And I can tell you that the anti-Semitism that the Jewish community is experiencing from these hate rallies, and by the way, you're right, we don't know what the intentions of every individual that's attending these rallies may have or may not have. One thing, though, that is clear is that we do have significant portions of crowds on tape, and this is public, it's online, chanting sometimes genocidal chants against the Jews. Yeah. And we see flags. We have seen the flag of Hezbollah, listed terrorist organization, Hamas, and there have been others, including the Taliban, at some of these rallies. This is very disturbing, and these are listed terrorist organizations. There should be no place for support of terror. And they're also, people have to be respectful of others and not blame individual Jews for the actions of Israel. And unfortunately, that is some of the anti-Semitism that we are seeing unleashed from these rallies. And that's what's caused great concern from the Jewish community perspective.
Yes, no, understood. Now, one final point to ask you about before we let you go, sir, is you heard off the top of our show that 33 members of Parliament have signed a letter to the Prime Minister urging him to join the calls for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. About 24 of his own caucus there as well. A lot of Toronto area MPs and MPs from across the country. What is your reaction to these calls? There is an urgent humanitarian need, though I recognize that you are obviously a clear champion of Israel's right to self-defense. What's the path forward here?
Yeah, and there's been a clear call by our government and by the leaders of various parties saying that Israel has the right of self-defense, as any country does, against such a deplorable, barbaric, and evil act of terror. But at the end of the day, a country has a right to defend itself or it does not. Calling for an immediate ceasefire is stating that Israel does not have the right to defend itself. Now, if we're having discussions about humanitarian corridor, and there is no question, there is terrible suffering taking place in Gaza right now. Nobody wants to see that, least of which the Jewish community. But Israel must defend itself. And that letter also called for compliance with international law and said that individual civilians should not be targeted by terror. And that's absolutely correct. But that terror is emanating from Hamas. And once again, going back to that hospital explosion, that's why the Prime Minister needs to speak out and needs to answer the question and needs to state quite clearly, as the Americans and France has, that it was not Israel, because these are terror groups misfiring rockets, attempting to murder Israelis, and yet, in fact, murdering the innocent civilians inside of Gaza. So by calling for this ceasefire and allowing for Hamas to rebuild itself and murder more Jews in the future, it's also going to be allowing Hamas to murder more innocent Gazans that they are unfortunately the dictators of right now. So Hamas must be dismantled. We cannot allow an abominable terrorist organization like this to continue to exist and kill so many.
Just as one final point on that, is there room in your view for a 24-hour ceasefire? You know what I mean? To facilitate a humanitarian corridor and a relief effort, because I know there are significant concerns that Hamas will divert aid that is sent in. This is why these 20 trucks that are waiting to get in at Rafah are being held up so they can be inspected and some security put around that. Is there room for that, or is it Israel we just need to find a way to mitigate the damage against civilians while Israel continues with its operations? How do you view it?
I know that Israel's doing everything that it possibly can. There were other countries involved. Egypt controls the southern border with Gaza, and those are discussions that all of those countries are going to have together. But really, at the end of the day, unfortunately, this is a military decision. Hamas needs to be completely dismantled so that they can never hurt Israelis like this ever again. There are hostages that are still inside of Gaza. And you know, as a civilian, I'm not knowledgeable enough about the details on the ground, but they are a trusted ally. It is a democracy, and we should be saying, you know, Canada is with you. And unfortunately, war is ugly and war is terrible. But let's not forget that this is, began with Hamas, with this destructive murder. And unfortunately, Israel has to defend itself and has to do what it has to do right now.
Michael Mostyn, the Chief Executive Officer of Brith Canada, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.